Isn't a life of passion really what we all want to aspire to have, to live for? Life of passion, life of passion, life of passion. Life of passion, the one that we should all These are the common questions that I have. These are the common questions that I have. These are the common questions that I have. These are the common questions that I have.
Deprogramming takes months. Deprogramming takes months.
These are the common questions that I have.
Deprogramming takes months.
These are the common questions that I have.
Deprogramming takes months.
Ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. Is good. Ignorance is. Anxiety is future. Anxiety is future. Anxiety is future. He is future. He is future. Depression is past. Depression is past. Depression is past. Past.
Yo, what's going on, everybody? Comrades, revolutionaries, truth seekers. Welcome to another episode of the Colonizer's Coffin, giving y'all blunt discussion, real news, cynical takes, pop culture, raw history, no chaser, all the good stuff. I'm your host, John Tell. Let's, as usual, embark on a journey through time and truths that shape our world, from untold stories of history to today's pressing issues. This is the space where knowledge meets revolution. And so today, we are going to be talking about some untold stories, or some stories that maybe not everyone is aware of. Now, as y'all can see, I operate out of Pennsylvania. It's where I have lived my entire life at. And I absolutely love this state. Funny enough, there are a lot of things that I dislike about this state, but Pennsylvania is so beautiful. There's so many amazing regions, so many amazing people. It's a diverse state, and above all, it is a very rich state in history. Pennsylvania is rich in a lot of resources, natural resources, but that has also in turn provided immense economy for Pennsylvania. I believe it's the fifth most populous state, and it has one of the biggest economies in the country. Now, Pennsylvania has always been historically tolerant of Black people or descendants of slaves, African Americans, whatever, all the way back to before slavery was even set into law in America. blacks were coming to Philadelphia, for example. Now, Coatesville is about 39 miles to the west of Philly. And when people were during the Great Migration coming from the South in prospect of better jobs and opportunities and better lives, Coatesville was a popular place to go because black people could succeed. They could get a nice, well-paying job at the local steel mill. Coatesville was known as the Pittsburgh of the East. Coatesville was one of the major cities in the country that helped bring us into that point of the industrial age where steel was a hot commodity and we needed it. We used our buildings. We used it to fuel the skyscraper race between Philadelphia, between New York and Chicago. For example, the World Trade Center steel came from Coatesville, Pennsylvania, from Lucas Steel. Anyway, black people would be able to raise the whole family, buy a home off of Luke and Steel, off of working in this town. So it was a great destination for black people to come to, even if they went to Philly. And yes, there's great opportunities in Philly, but Coatesville's smaller. It's not as populated. It's cleaner at that time. And so it was a place where it was segregated. From my understanding, West End in Coatesville was where white people lived, and East End was where black people lived. And black people were not allowed in West End at all. So just a reminder that, even though Jim Crow South was going on, there still were different things going on in the North that were very much discriminatory as well. And I'll get into a bit of that as well. So I'm going to be talking about the lynching of Zachariah Walker. And a lot of people are not really aware of this. A lot of people they can't fathom the fact that there was a lynching that happened in the North, in Pennsylvania, and this was well after the Civil War. This lynching took place in 1911, y'all. 1911. And to be quite honest, the country was outraged. People were shocked that this went on in Pennsylvania. People were shocked as to what events took place. And I will get into those events because they are pretty shocking. The events that happened in my hometown of Coatesville, Pennsylvania, went down in history for sure. Simply because this is something that people had expected to see or hear from happening in the South, in the southern states like, Alabama, Georgia. This is the kind of stuff that you would hear happening there. But 40 miles west of Philly, people outside of Coatesville were outraged, but people in Coatesville, like whites, for example, let me compare. So in 2022, there was a young man named God, why is it escaping me? There's a young black man that was kidnapped and tortured, and the whole town conspired to not cooperate with authorities or anyone that wanted details on this murder. So essentially, that's what happened in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, when the NAACP went to do an investigation. People hindered that investigation, and that outraged not only the governor but the whole country as to how this could happen in Pennsylvania. The governor went so far as to say that Coatesville was a disgrace to the state. We even lost our designation on the map for quite a while. In other words, Coatesville's name was taken off the map for a while. Yeah. So let me get into the story here. because this is a pretty juicy one, and there also are books that you can go and get and find more about this story. Because I'm going to go and get these books, and they do show a lot of visuals from that time to help paint the picture. So this one book is called Coatesville and the Lynching of Zachariah Walker, Death in a Pennsylvania Steel Town. And this one is called No Crooked Death, Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and the Lynching of Zachariah Walker. So again, Coatesville is a steel mill town. When you go to Coatesville, the steel mills dominate the entire city. You can't go anywhere in Coatesville without coming across in some aspect. But a good third of the city is populated by these steel mills or old steel mills or property that used to have a warehouse on it or so on and so forth. But the steel mill literally runs straight through the center of the town because the Brandywine River, the Brandywine Creek runs through the town, and that's how they operated the steel mills, was off of the river. So this town is full of steel. It's full of these steel mills. It's part of the nature of this town. So keep that in mind. It's kind of what solidified. I'll give you an example. White people sometimes would get jealous if a black person got promoted. I know of a situation of a family member who was murdered because he got a promotion, and his boss, who was white, wanted his son to get that job. So lots of quote unquote accidents would always happen to black folk, and then you just see a white person take that job. So even though there were lots of opportunities for blacks in Coatesville, there was still reason to be vigilant. All right. So the lynching of Zachariah Walker occurred on August 13th, 1911. 1911, y'all. So slavery was what? That was the Civil War was 65 it ended. And officially. And so this is like what, 50 years later? Yeah, it's like 50 years later. So a white mob attacked and burned a black steel worker. Zachariah Walker was burned alive in retaliation for reportedly killing Edgar Rice, who was a white Worth Brothers Steel Company police officer. And so at that time, Coatesville was dominated by two different steel companies. One was Lucan Steel, which is what most people know of. Lucan's ended up dominating Coatesville. So Lucan Steel and Coatesville, Pennsylvania are synonymous, basically. But at that time, the Worth Brothers Steel Company was around. And so right here is a photo of part of the Coastal Police Force with Edgar Rice, the one who was allegedly murdered by Zachariah Walker. I believe is the third one from the left at the top. So you see the black man on the left, the white man next to him, and then the white man next to him. That one right there would be Edgar Rice, who was reportedly murdered. So between 1900 and 1910, Coatesville became home to increasing numbers of African Americans and foreign-born whites, mostly immigrants like Irish, Germans, Italians, European immigrants who settled in Coatesville were unable to live in residential areas inhabited by U.S.-born whites, and begrudgingly resorted to living near the town's African American populations. This institutionalized ethnic hierarchy turned the town into a highly suspicious and segregated community. And so that echoes what I was saying before. Even though there was lots of opportunities for poor whites and free blacks, or black people in general, there was still lots of tension, and people still forget that this took place in the North. Like, just because the North happened to be free states doesn't mean that there wasn't racism, there wasn't prejudice. There was. There certainly was. So this happened on August 12th originally, right? So I'm going to go ahead and get into this story for y'all because it's, yeah. All right. So on August 12th, Zachariah Walker, an African-American resident of Coatesville, fired his handgun near a small group of immigrant workers with the intention to scare them. Mind you, Zachariah Walker had just came from a bar. He had been drinking, and it's not out of the ordinary to have a gun on you, especially in these times. Like, you want to defend yourself. He felt every right to defend himself. By all means, have a gun. But again, he was drinking, and he fired a handgun at a small group of immigrant workers. Edgar Rice, who was one of the Worth brothers, Steele police officers, confronted Walker and threatened to club him. Walker responded by saying he would retaliate and kill him, allegedly. Both Zachariah Walker and Edgar Rice drew their guns. Walker was the first to pull the trigger and shot Edgar twice, and he died quickly afterwards. So they basically had a little shootout, right? And then Zachariah took off running. So after witnesses reported Edgar Rice's murder, allegedly at the hands of Zachariah, locals searched the nearby area for him. A young farm boy discovered him hiding in a barn, and informed two search party members. Zachariah scared the men away with his gun before they could apprehend him. And then the next day, on the 13th, a group of firefighters spotted Walker concealed in a tree. And as they tried to apprehend him, he attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head. The bullet got lodged in his jaw. Walker ended up in custody, and a district attorney and two police officers claimed that he confessed to the crime, saying, quote, "I killed him easy." So he went through surgery, and they removed the bullet from his jaw and let him rest at what was known as Coatesville Hospital. The Coatesville Hospital sits on a small hill overlooking the west end of Coatesville. And so at that time, it was known as Coatesville Hospital. Today, it's a nursing home. I think they closed it down. I'm not sure. But at the time, that's where he was being held. So when people found out that he was not dead and that he was indeed resting, he had gotten surgery for attempting suicide, accidentally hitting himself, whatever you want to call it, because I feel this is all still alleged. This isn't his words, these are other people's words, but an angry mob of about 2,000 Coatesville residents camped outside the Coatesville Hospital where Walker was recovering. Soon after, they surrounded the hospital, and the mob easily pushed aside Walker's police guard. He only had one guard. And if you think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, if any of y'all know about how the Black Wall Street massacre began, it was off a lie that a black man had fondled a white woman, and he was being held in a jail cell. A mob came in and ripped him out. This kind of thing is very common for not this time, but previous to this. It was still common in the South too. I mean, look at the Bloody Summer, which happened several years after this incident. So anyway, they proceeded to drag, mind you, Zachariah Walker, I guess either for his protection or because they didn't want him to escape while he was recovering, they handcuffed him to the bed. So it's not like he can leave anyway. So the mob came into the hospital, easily pushed aside the police guard, proceeded to drag Walker out of the hospital while he was still chained to the bed, and the mob killed Walker by throwing him into a makeshift funeral pyre. Yeah. After Walker's brutal murder, most of his remains, get this, and I talk about this a lot because it's very interesting, and I wonder who has this stuff. His remains were scavenged by souvenir hunters. Several members of the mob gathered some of his charred remains in a small box and dropped them off at the local hospital. On the box, there was a note that read, "Return to his friend." So they left specific, and this, I'm reading this off of Wikipedia, but I have other information. I can't remember what it was, but there were specific parts of his body that they left, quote unquote, for his friends. But majority of the body, we don't know where it is. It's spread out amongst people that lived in Coatesville at that time. His remains could be anywhere, sitting up on somebody's shelf like a trophy for all we know. This is the real deal. This is something that happened 100 years ago, essentially, right in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, y'all. So again, we don't know exactly what has become of all of his remains. I'm still curious as to what happened to that box and if it does happen to sit somewhere in one of the museums. But not long after the lynching, the Coatesville Record newspaper had reported that a large crowd of townsfolk had eagerly watched Walker's burning. Some even collected his charred remains after the fire died down. The Record interviewed Edgar Rice's widow, who was very upset because she had not personally lit Walker's pyre. So think about that for a second. The person who is mourning the victim's death doesn't seem to show any revenge towards the person who killed her husband. It was the people, the white racist residents of Coatesville that took it upon themselves to do this. Outside of Coatesville, nearly every newspaper condemned Walker's lynching as an act of inhumanity. Former President Theodore Roosevelt publicly condemned lynching in general. The New York Evening Post proclaimed shock that such a brutal lynching could take place in a northern state. Yeah. And even the Atlanta Journal noted the practice of lynching could no longer be seen as an exclusively Southern crime. The Richmond Planet suggested that African Americans might arm themselves to prevent further lynchings. And remind you, this man was armed from jump. And I want to excuse, because some people tend to bring up the fact that he brought this on himself because he happened to have a gun and was drunk and yada, yada, yada. He had a gun. He was drunk. He happened to be black. And that's why he got what happened to him. Had he been white, do you think that would have happened that way? I think if he was white and had a shoot off with a person and accidentally killed them, he would be sitting behind bars. But he wouldn't have had a mob angrily rip him out of a hospital in his hospital bed that he was chained to and burn him alive and then break up his body and take souvenirs. So it is very, that is something that you do have to be mindful of, is the double standard of the time. And I think it does play a part into why the country was very outraged by this happening again. It was 1911. Also, Pennsylvania authorities vigorously investigated the lynching, but were constantly impeded by white Coatesville residents who refused to cooperate with authorities and journalists. According to the reporter William Ellis, Coatesville residents seemed to condemn journalists rather than Walker's lynch mob. Nevertheless, a month after Walker's death, the state of Pennsylvania indicted 6 men for the murder. All of them were subsequently acquitted. Several other defendants were later indicted were also cleared of crimes as well. And not long after, all of Walker's suspected killers were acquitted. The governor at the time, John K. Tenner, called the residents of Coatesville a disgrace to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for either carrying out or aiding murder. according to an historian, William Ziegler, the murder of Zachariah Walker became one of the best-known lynchings of its time because of its unusually brutal nature and because it took place in a state which was seen as historically tolerant of African Americans. Walker's lynching led many Northern African Americans to worry about America's lack of racial justice. After a meeting in Denver, Colorado, the National Negro Educational Association came to the conclusion that white people and African Americans lived under different rules in the same country. And Zachariah Walker was the last of 8 known people to be lynched in Pennsylvania. Many locals, we are very aware of this story. It's something that we know of and we're aware of. His name, as soon as people hear, they know the story. Most people do know the story. If you have historically lived in Coatesville, where my ancestry in Coatesville goes back deep. My ancestry in Lancaster County goes back deep. And so I do have enough ties to know about this, but there is as you can see here, a historical marker depicting, explaining, giving a little detail about the event and what took place. Coatesville is a town of roughly 13,000 people, very diverse. I believe it's like 6,000 Black people, 3,000 white people, 3,000 Latinx people, respectively, and other races, cultures, ethnicities. It is a melting pot of people, but it wasn't always that way in that sense. It was always, for the longest, pretty segregated in a lot of ways. Coatesville has made lots of strides in recent years to revitalize their economy and redevelopment, and they're doing a great job of that. And I feel that because this dark history of Coatesville exists, it's not something that we shy away from, though. We've actually leaned into it because it adds context to the history of this city and why it is the way it is. Every place has a dark piece of their history, and it's important to still touch on it, understand it, to understand where you can go, or where you should be going, or where you maybe need to go. But yeah, you can go to Google and find lots and lots of information on Zachariah Walker. In 2011, they had the 100th anniversary of the lynching, and they had a memorial service dedicated to the incident. And so I just found something else actually referring to the 1919 Coatesville call to arms. The 1919 Coatesville call to arms was when the Black community of Coatesville formed a large armed group to prevent a rumored lynching. Only later, when the armed group had surrounded the jail to prevent the lynching, did they learn that there was no suspect and no white lynch mob. But it would be understandable that they did that because 8 years prior was Zachariah Walker's lynching, and they clearly did not want a repeat of that. So on July 6th of 1919, a 14-year-old white girl was allegedly attacked by a Black man they tied to a tree, and there was a rumor that he had been arrested and a white mob was assembling to lynch him. So, because everyone had been scarred by the 1911 lynching of Zachariah 8 years prior, a large group of Coatesville's black people armed themselves and marched downtown to protect the jail from the white mob. When they arrived, the mayor and a local assured the crowd that the rumor was false. A number of leaders of the march were arrested and charged with inciting a riot, even though they had assembled to stop a rumored white riot. All of the 9 people arrested were later released. This uprising was one of the several incidents of civil unrest that began in the so-called American Red Summer that I was speaking of before, of 1919. The summer consisted of terrorist attacks on black communities and white oppression in over 3 dozen cities and counties. In most cases, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, and in some cases, black community groups resisted the attacks, especially in Chicago and DC. Most deaths occurred in rural areas during events like the Elaine Race Riot in Arkansas, where an estimated 100 to 240 black people and 5 white people were killed. Also in 1919 was the Chicago Race Riot and the DC Race Riot, which killed 38 and 39 people respectively, and with both having many more non-fatal injuries and extensive property damage reaching up into the billions of dollars. And so I'm going to put links in the chat so people can get more information. And when I get a chance, I'm going to find links to those books as well for folks to check out too. As you can see here, this is one of the views that you can look at right in the center of the city, and you can see nothing but steel mills. That is Coatesville. So I really hope that y'all found this information enlightening. It's a sobering story. It is something that I do, in a sense, take pride of because it is history that happened in my hometown. But it is still, nonetheless, a very dark stain on not only Coatesville, Pennsylvania, but the history of America. And being post Civil War and pre-Red Summer, it adds a lot of context to both. So we're reaching the end of today's episode. As usual, I want to thank all y'all always joining this journey. Your engagement, your questions, and your thoughts. Revolutionary narratives, what it is. Don't forget to tune in next time, y'all, for another chapter of Revelations. Hit the like button, share this stream. If you're watching from YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Remember, Coffin is open till the case is closed. This is John Tell. Stay revolutionary.